Audio Jungle.
Welcome to La Excellence. I am Harsha Mannava and we are discussing this book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. We've been at this for quite some time now. I hope I've tried my best to keep you engaged and I hope it worked. So we are about to close this section. We just have two more videos. In this video, I'm clubbing together two chapters, chapter 18 and chapter 19. And I'm trying to finish both of them together because they're basically dealing with the same issue. So both these chapters are like two parts to the same issue. Hence, I thought since we already have quite a long list of videos for the book, I thought I'll make it look simple for you by clubbing these two and making it brief and concise. So if this video is slightly longer than our usual other videos, please bear with me. The length of the video is a consequence of the fact that we have tried to merge two chapters into one video. So with that caution, let me begin. Where were we before in the previous video? We were trying to understand this whole issue of scientific revolution, and we said it began 500 years ago. After scientific revolution, we went to industrial revolution and saw how energy, resources and raw materials were at the very center of that entire process we called industrial revolution. And we just began examining the impact of this so-called industrial revolution. It's called revolution for a reason. The reason is that it changed dramatically how we lived, how we do things. The effect on society, polity, economy has been profound. So today we take up the chapter called as a permanent revolution. So in this video, our focus will primarily be on trying to understand what have been the impact, what have been the effects of scientific revolution on society, economy and polity. We'll discuss the good, we'll discuss the bad, and finally we'll ask a very philosophical question. Sorry if I sound very abstract, but philosophy makes us examine what it is to be human, what it is to be a man. So since we're discussing Homo sapien, let us also get a bit philosophical towards the end. And we'll ask the simplest philosophical question, that is, has all this progress, has all this inventions, wealth, prosperity, have they made human life happier? That is, has scientific revolution made us happier? And on that context, we'll also examine what does it mean to be happy? What is the meaning of happiness? Does Buddha help us here? So we are going back to ancient India. We are going back to 2500 years to understand what it means to be happy in the context of the present science. So with that, let us get into this chapter, that is a permanent revolution. So before industrial revolution, the population was very little, but today where do we stand? We are at 7 billion and still growing. So humans has taken over the world, and behind this human takeover of the world is the fact that industrial revolution gave them enormous power, resilience to capture natural resources, which made them tap a wide array of resources. So the planet, this resulted in enormous ecological destruction, and we are becoming a concrete jungle, and we are dumping our plastic residues in ocean. So we have drastically improved our standards of living and our material comforts, but all of this has come with enormous ecological destruction, and we are looming at this impending threat, the the next pandemic probably, that is the climate change. It's like a clock that is ticking. Just like COVID-19, climate change is a threat that we have been warned for a long time, but we were too ignorant, we were too confident that it will not come in our times. So we are looking at climate change. But how did this industrial revolution change? Like I said in the previous video, the first obvious impact of industrial revolution is urbanization. So industrial revolution was followed by massive urbanization. We started seeing growth of towns and the population. We saw enormous shift from rural to urban. So rural-urban migration took off, and growth of large-scale industries, large-scale cities and towns around industries. So urbanization is the first most important change. And that was followed by, because of urbanization, earlier people used to work on the fields, but now the place of work shifted from their villages, homestead plots to a different location, that is factory. Earlier, a family used to come together, pool its labor resources and work on the land. Now, all of them started moving to cities, and in cities they began working in what are called as factories with strangers. So earlier father, grandfather, brothers, sons, they all used to contribute labor and work on a farm. But now people started moving to factories, and now in a factory they have to work in a very mechanical way, isn't it? How does a factory work? Each person has a specific role, and each person has to complete that job in a given time. And he has to repeat the process over and over, again and again, every day, over the weeks, months and years. So in that sense, the organic living or the human connect that was there in traditional agriculture was slowly giving way to a mechanical life that was characteristic of an industrial system of production. And what was the most strongest contribution of this? It is people started now being what are called as clock beings. Clock and time. We have timetables, and we have to wake up at a particular time. We have to catch a bus or a train, metro at a particular time, go to factory at a particular time, finish the job at a particular time, then the lunch break, so on. Because each of us are cogs in an enormous big wheel, and the wheel works on the fact that everybody is delivering on their commitments. So time became a very important factor, and this can be seen in the huge scale at which the emphasis on time through timetables, through various clocks, constantly throughout the day we check our clock hundreds of times. So this modern emphasis and obsession with time has its basis in what we call as the Industrial Revolution. That's one way. But what is, in terms of personal life, how did Industrial Revolution changes? Industrial Revolution gave a big push or big jolt to family system. Earlier, our family system was largely joint family, extended family. We had huge people living in huge families. But thanks to Industrial Revolution, nuclear family took up, became very important. If you had to imagine life 300 years ago, when agriculture was the only way of life, people lived in villages, in large extended families. So they had, this extended family was surrounded by a community, that is the village, or in India the caste group. So family was the place that raised children. Family was the source of meeting sexual needs. Family was a source of education, because the children learnt whatever they had to learn, values, skills, what they need to make a living, those were learnt in the family environment. And family was an economic group as well. As we said, the brothers, the parents, the children, all of them together contribute labor to work on a farm. So family had multiple roles: economic, educational, sexual, psychological, everything. In fact, disputes used to be settled between families. A person does not matter. So if two people fight, the two families come together to settle the dispute. And if somebody got old or sick, once again the family used to be the institution that used to take care of them. So traditional family had multiple functions. It was extended with many people living in the same household. And family had such a central role in society that if somebody was rebelling or was abandoned by his family, his life was as good as dead, because nobody would take care of him. He would either join an army and become a soldier, or would end up being a slave to somebody else. So family life, one could not imagine life without family. That was the importance family had traditionally. But how did that all change? All that changed with industrialization, because as industrial economy began developing, state and market took charge. State and market began to meet various needs that people had. So the functions that family was providing were slowly given up to other institutions, other market mechanisms. For example, at one time family used to provide education. Today what happens? There are schools, colleges, coaching institutions, online classes, everything. So educational function has shifted to to schools and educations. It has moved out of family. Similarly, economic activity. Today, apart from some family businesses, most others, family is not an economic group. Your father could work in one place, your brother could be working in another place, your grandfather had a different job, you have a different job. People wake up in the morning, go to their office, work with total strangers. The people they work with are not the members of their family. Earlier, the people who you worked with were also your family. Today that is not the situation. So office, corporations, businesses, they have all come up independently of family. Similarly, if there is old care, or if you are broke, you go to a bank to borrow funds. If there's a death in the family, there's an insurance company that takes care of your health costs, or that provides you your life insurance. So, and if there's an old age person, there is old age homes, there are pension systems, all these support systems have come up. So family's functions have been broken one by one, and family's role today is largely restricted to sexual, even that there are today solutions outside family, and sexual functions and psychological. That is where family still is having monopoly. That is love, emotion and care. Family still has that core function. This is the functional aspect of family. What about its structure? Earlier you had large scale extended families, but today we are shifting towards nuclear families, small scale. What is the nuclear family? Two parents and their children, that's it. We no longer have large families living in huge houses with brothers, multiple brothers. We only see that in movies. We go to movies to watch a joint family because we don't see one anymore. So we have to watch a joint family in a movie. It's like a science fiction. That is the situation we are in, because we have moved to extended nuclear family. And this whole change has been driven by an ideology, that is the ideology of individualism. Everywhere you are told, live your life on your terms, discover your life, be an individual, your job, pursue, explore, take time to explore, figure out what you want to do, figure out the vocation you want to take up, figure out the hobbies you want to take up, the person you want to marry, explore, have friends, go on dates, and then finally zero in on a person. So the whole philosophy of society is being pushed towards individualism. Earlier it was not so. Who you married, your family decides for you. What job you have, your family decides. So earlier society used to run on collective thinking, collectivism. An individual did not matter, the group mattered. Each person had to make decisions based on what was best for the group and not what was best for himself or herself. But today the individual is being liberated. We celebrate individualism and this individualism has given us a lot of space and freedom, true, but it has also made us alienated, because we have cut off our connection from everybody else. In the name of individualism and freedom, we are becoming isolated, alienated, we have fewer relations, we are connected to few people, we only have casual relations. So that is the consequence of individualism. Next, what is the other impact of industrial revolution? The other impact of industrial revolution was the rapidity at which change has been taking place. If you looked at life, if somebody was living in 1000 AD and somehow let us assume he slept for 500 years and woke up at 1500 AD, he would find there was some change, yes, but he would not find it shocking. Okay, instead of using a blunt knife, they have developed technology to use a more sharper knife. Earlier I used to plow my field with a very crude weapon, now they have a more efficient weapon, instrument, tool, that's all. He would not find himself totally out of place in the world after 500 years. But if a man of 1500 AD slept for 500 years and woke up in 2010 or 2020, he cannot understand this. He would be shocked, amused, and probably also very disappointed. He doesn't know what is internet, what is social media, what is nuclear missile. He won't know what is an aeroplane, what's a space mission. They've gone to Mars and Moon. So that has been the extent to which society is changing in our present times. So in no other point of human history has society changed at this rapidity. So we are in a phase of incessant change, enormous change, huge change at a very, very rapid pace. That's the fact we have to deal with, and this is creating a lot of chaos, anomie. People are living in a state of anomie, as Durkheim, a sociologist, called it. Confusion, not knowing what is right, what is good, not knowing which value is correct, which value is wrong. So when you see rapists like the Disha murder, Nirbhaya murder, no doubt they've done a very ruthless crime. But such crimes are not because those individuals are psychos. It is because of this anomie that society is going through a flux, but people's thinking, people's values, morals are not adapting to the present system. So a villager, when he comes to a cosmopolitan town like Delhi or Hyderabad and sees women who are very liberal, who dress differently, who are outgoing, they don't understand that women, and they look at these women in terms of their value system. In village value system, any woman who dresses liberally is calling for open sex. But when you look at a city women who are in cities, they still apply that same mindset. So this kind of confused morality is what is leading to crimes, violence, and many other social problems. That is the second or third important aspect. But industrial revolution and all this rapid change has not always caused this problem. To be sure, it was not always negative. What we discussed so far might look like, yes, it's a bad thing. Family has been destroyed, rapid change, anomie, we have become mechanical because of constant obsession with time. But there's also a very, very important development, important positive contribution. What is that? That is peace. At no other point of time in human history was the world so peaceful as it is in the last few hundreds of years. True, there was the two world wars, but you will realize at least after 1950 the world has remained largely peaceful, and today more people die of suicide than they die because of warfare. That is because people have realized the value of peace thanks to this industrial society and industrial economy. That's the reason war has become an outdated concept. China and US, they may speak in so much harsh language, but do you think two nuclear armed states will attack each other? Impossible. Likewise, India and China or India and Pakistan, a war is ruled out, not at all possible. So we are living in a world that is quite peaceful compared to world at any other point of time. If you study anthropology, for example, you will realize a lot of social institutions have developed around the fact that men would die in warfare. So the fact that men had high mortality was a reason behind development of things like matriliny or matriarchy and matrilocal. That was because since the men would die frequently in warfare, women would be the agent persons through which lineage would pass so that they could take care of children. So many social institutions developed around the fact that societies had warfare. People used to live in fear that if they sleep tonight, the people from neighboring village could come and raid them and they may die in sleep. In fact, if you watch some documentaries on the Nagas, the elder Nagas who live, Nagas are a very violent tribe. They live in Nagaland, they are a very violent tribe. The elders tell you stories of how they lived in constant fear of raids. You never know when the neighbors could come, raid your village, kill you, rape your women, destroy the village and take a loot with all the goods. So when people are living in tribal society, they always lived in constant fear of their neighbors and war was always a looming threat. Of course, they didn't have guns or cannons or missiles, but war was still a very strong possibility at their level of technology. They would fight with bow and arrows, machetes and crude knives, whatever. The Nagas are known for head hunting. They used to remove the head of the neighbors and use and decorate their homes with the heads they've collected as trophies. So a Naga man's prestige is not on how much wealth he has, but on how many heads he's collected. That was the kind of violent culture many tribes, many people lived for a long time. So compared to all that, we are living in a very peaceful times. And what is the evidence for it? Just look at two major events that happened in 20th century. First, decolonization. Second, the collapse of Soviet Union. Both have happened with tremendous peace. Decolonization. Decolonization is when all these European powers, France, British, gave up all their colonies and restricted and gave independence. So the Indian independence is part of the larger global trend of decolonization. And when there was decolonization, what used to happen? We expected so much violence, but British, except remote instances like French leaving Algeria, apart from those remote incidences, all these European powers left lock, stock and barrel from all the Afro-Asian colonies in a very peaceful manner. The British left India in relative peace. They didn't resist. They gave freedom 1 year in advance to their original date. They thought they'll leave in 1948, but they left a year prior. So was the story in other parts. The French gave some resistance in Vietnam, the Indo-French peninsula, that is Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, but they still left peacefully. So that's how decolonization happened without real blood and warfare. Next, Soviet Union. Soviet Union fought the Cold War for nearly 40 years. They suffered very badly at the Nazi hands, the Nazi Germany in World War II. And they were nuclear power. So when Soviet Union collapsed, it was believed, many thought if the Union, many didn't believe it will collapse. And when it finally collapsed in 1989, many political scientists had a nightmare that what if the Russian President Gorbachev, what if he tries to use force to make sure the other republics stay within the Union, like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Georgia, Armenia, so on. What if the Russian army uses its force and violence to crush this movement for independence? But luckily they didn't do that. The collapse was a shock to the world, but it happened very smoothly. So this is how the world has realized that peace is very important. Now why did they realize peace is very important? First, the cause of war. There are 4 factors why peace has become so important. First was the fact that the price of war has become very, very high. Today in a nuclear age, war means MAD, that is mutually assured destruction. If US attacks China, China also attacks US with nuclear weapons. So both will destroy. So in a nuclear world, war can only mean collective suicide. Similarly, the costs of war, like the nuclear weapons made the cost of war very high, the benefits also decreased. Earlier when there was warfare, one army would go, attack, win the war, destroy the country, take all the wealth, material wealth and leave, because wealth was primarily material form throughout much of history. But let us say today China takes its army, conquers California and Silicon Valley. Does it? Because that's the richest part of US, right? That's where all these corporations are, Google, Facebook, Amazon. But by conquering that land, will it conquer its wealth? No, because the wealth of California is not in material form. It is in the human capital form. It is in the brains of all the software engineers. If California is conquered, they will leave California and go to some other place which gives them freedom to work independently. So today wealth, the form of wealth, is not in material resources, though some part of wealth is in material resources. Much of the wealth is in the form of stock exchange, shares, intellect, intelligence, coding skills. So the nature of wealth has changed, and this wealth cannot be acquired through force. So it has to be acquired by creating conducive environment for innovation, using soft power. All these have become important. So the benefits of war are no longer relevant today. Next, peace became also very lucrative, very profitable because of the world trade. China now wants peace because if China goes for war, its trade will get damaged, and China benefits from huge trade. So nations realized that they are better off in peace because they can trade and benefit and get all the benefits. So trade has linked the world has connected the world. So if US wants to attack China, let's say US try, and because of trade, the world has become so interconnected that if US wants to attack China, it cannot do that without actually harming itself, because much of the US production is in China. So by attacking China, US is actually attacking itself, isn't it? If US attacks China, it's actually attacking US. So US is going to attack itself, because much of what is in China is, if US attacks China, much of the damages to US is going to be very high, because much of what is there in China is US own companies' production. So US economy will come to a halt if they destroy China. So globalization and interconnectedness has made war almost impossible. That's why there can be no war between these two great economies. Similarly, the fourth factor is change in political culture. Political culture has changed. Today, the elite, the rulers, all of them are not war-mongering and trigger-happy. Those of the likes like Trump could be an exception, but by and large, the political culture of the world has moved towards peace, world peace, justice, liberty, self-determination. All of these have been accepted. The world is now thinking in terms of global cooperation, because problems like terrorism, climate change cannot be dealt by nations. They need collective world cooperation. So cooperation is the driving force of political culture than warfare. So all these facts have made war a near impossibility, and that's the reason the world that we are living in is by far one of the most peaceful worlds that humanity has known. So this is chapter 18. Next, in chapter 19, Harari poses a very, very interesting, important question. He says, human society has undergone enormous change in the past 500 years. So we discussed all those changes in the past to this video and the previous video, how political system, economy, all society, family, all these have changed. So there are huge benefits, there is a lot of wealth, we have medicine, modern medicine is an outcome of industrial revolution, biotechnology, we have cures like antibiotics, vaccines that saved us from diseases that killed our ancestors. We talked about the story of Richard the Lionheart, a majestic king of England. He died just because an arrow had hit his shoulder. So from there we have come a long way. We have antibiotics, chemotherapy, vaccines, so many developments in medicine that we are able to live comfortably, free of disease for a long time. So, but all this development, all this wealth, prosperity, has it made humans happy? Isn't it? That's ultimately, should we judge development by the wealth it is generating, or should we judge development by the happiness it is creating? Is the ultimate objective of all human endeavor, is it wealth or is it happiness? We are pursuing wealth because we love wealth, or we pursue wealth because we assume wealth gives us happiness. Isn't happiness the actual goal? If that is the actual goal, are we really happy? Let us examine this question in little detail. I know it's going to get philosophical, but please bear with me because I'm sure you will enjoy the beauty in this philosophical question. First, to understand happiness, we have to understand what is unhappiness. So there is so much literature, debate on what is happiness. Let us see what is happiness. First, what causes unhappiness? Definitely, being in poverty is a source of unhappiness because you need some material goods to keep your body going, meet your material needs. So, poverty is definitely causing unhappiness, isn't it? At the same time, being a billionaire also does not mean you are happy. Poverty definitely, having income below a particular level can be source of unhappiness. But once you start earning and you cross this threshold and you make money, the more and more money you make, the money you make to cross the line could give you happiness. But after reaching a particular level of income, the extra money you make will only give you extra wealth, but it may not give you happiness because you have met your material needs, they're over. Likewise, health can cause unhappiness, ill health. If you are suffering from disease, cancer, heart ailment, leprosy, all these diseases, or you have one of your limbs has been amputated, paralyzed, all these can be disability, all these can be source of unhappiness. So if somebody has good health, then probably he is not unhappy. So what can we say about happiness? What causes happiness? According to most scholars, happiness comes from, it is caused by having a good loving spouse, a caring family, and a well-knit community. These three cause happiness. And happiness also exists along with these three when there are two other conditions. One, you are not poor. Second, your health is in good condition. Provided you have these three and have these other two, that's when generally people are happy. So a man who is not making a lot of money but has a loving wife, caring family, and a well-knit community with decent levels of income and with good health, he is probably very happy than an alienated billionaire who is all living by himself in a palace without family, without having anybody else, and suffering from obesity or cancer at 70. So this man probably is happier than the billionaire. Ironical, but that's how it is. So that is what we understand by happiness. But there are three popular views on happiness. People try to define or give an objective meaning to happiness. They try to approach this problem of happiness through three directions, three broad methods. First, the first approach was a biochemical one. People said happiness is after all a mental state. So it must be guided by some hormones. So to make oneself happy, one just has to take hormones. In fact, that is the approach doctors use to treat patients who are in depression. They give medicines with serotonin. So serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, these are chemicals that generally make us improve our moods. So some have said that happiness is a biochemical issue. So to make one person happy, you must inject more and more biochemicals. That is the first approach. It's a purely biochemical, mechanical model. Second, people equated happiness to pleasure. Some said happiness is nothing but pleasure. Smoking gives me pleasure, that's smoking is a source of happiness. Drinking gives me pleasure, that's a source of happiness. Driving a car fast to the extent that I may crash the car gives me thrill and pleasure, that's again happiness. So some try to equate happiness with pleasure. Pleasure is instantaneous. Happiness is ephemeral, permanent. They don't distinguish these two. Some scholars have tried to equate both. They said happiness is pleasure. Pleasure can come from drinking, smoking, eating junk food, tasty food, pizza. It can come from sex. Pleasure can come from making a lot of money, can come from wealth. All these can give you pleasure, but they don't give you happiness. So the second model is flawed because it assumes happiness is pleasure without realizing happiness and pleasure are two different concepts. Finally, the third view is that happiness is about finding meaning. So the third school believes that happiness is to find meaning in life, find purpose for life. That's the meaning definition of happiness. Each person must go about finding their meaning. This makes sense to an extent, but it has limitations, not perfect. That finally brings us to the question. You may now be asking, why is he telling us some wrong models? Why doesn't he tell us what is happiness? So Harari tells us happiness is not any of these three models, it is something else. And here Harari taps into Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist ideology to tell us what is happiness. He approaches this happiness problem from a Buddhist point of view. What does Buddha tell us? Buddha tells that happiness comes from knowing truth about oneself. Please observe it again. Happiness comes from knowing truth about oneself. That's the source of happiness. First point is knowing truth about oneself. Now what is this truth that you must know about yourself? According to Buddha, the truth that we must all know is that we tend to equate, each person tends to equate oneself with one's feelings. You think you are your feelings, but Buddha says no, you are not your feelings. Because most people think they are their feelings, they do another mistake. Because they think they judge themselves from the viewpoint of their feelings, the second mistake they do is they want happiness, they equate happiness to positive feelings, and they equate lack of happiness to negative feelings. So they differentiate, they equate themselves to their feelings. Now their feelings are broken into positive and negative. And they think positive feelings are source of happiness, negative feelings are not. Hence they must pursue positive feelings. That's the thinking many of us have. When we say, I feel craving, I have a craving to buy the next iPhone. I have a feeling that I must go and gorge on the pizza. I have to gorge on the pasta. All these are feelings. I feel so, hence I must do it. All that comes from the basic thinking that we assume we are our feelings. And our feelings can be of two types, positive, negative. Positive are happiness, negative are not happy. Hence, the whole effort in life is to avoid negative feelings and pursue positive feelings. This pursuit, this endless pursuit of positive feelings characterizes most of our lives. Our success, our wealth, our social behavior, all this is to maximize positive feelings, isn't it? But behind this entire struggle is the assumption that we are our feelings. And we get stuck in this endless struggle where we are pursuing one and avoiding another. That's the story. But Buddha says people are liberated when they realize that they are not their feelings. They are more than their feelings. Their feelings are only one part of them, a part that they should learn to ignore, a part which they should not take too seriously. And when they realize that their feelings are impermanent, you feel a craving, so you go and eat some junk food. The craving is gone, your feeling has been met. But does that give any permanent change to you? Not really. The moment you've eaten that junk food, your feeling has disappeared. It has not really given you anything of long-term consequence. 1 year down the line, if you want to think of a memorable moment of the previous year, that craving for pizza, that craving for biryani will not be the moment that comes to your mind. That was just some instantaneous craving, instantaneous pull factor. One which Buddha says you must learn to resist. So Buddha says a person moves towards happiness when he accepts that feelings are impermanent and learns to ignore them. Ignore the feelings and instead learns to live in the present. Feelings are always making you think in terms of future. Today you think of tomorrow, tomorrow of day after, but you never think of today about today. So Buddha says, learn to ignore your feelings and accept they're impermanent, and instead live in the present instead of fantasizing about the future. Living in the present, that's actually what meditation teaches us. Meditation is all about trying to live in the moment, and that is tried to achieve by focusing on your breath, the most basic aspect of present. Because breath defines the moment, because breathlessness can kill you. So meditation is a mechanism whereby we are trying to ignore the noise and focus on the present. So finally, what is Buddha recommending? What are Buddha's steps to happiness? First, stop pursuit of all external achievements like wealth, success, materialism. Second, Buddha also says you must stop pursuit of feelings, not just external achievements. Also learn to ignore your internal feelings. Don't take them seriously. Hunger, success, wealth, learn to ignore them. And third, Buddha says live in the moment and practice the present. Enjoy the moment. This is the third step Buddha says. And how do you acquire all this? How do you achieve all this? Buddha has given a set of meditation techniques which allow us to accept the reality as it is without trying to fight it away. And that, Harari says, is the ultimate source of happiness. No amount of wealth, no amount of success can take us to happiness. But this secret is what takes us to happiness. So that's why Harari says, yes, the industrial revolution has done some things. It has taken away poverty, at least in the Western world. It has allowed most of us to be healthy, but that's all it did. But it created new problems like crime, obesity, broken down families, obsession with success. All these are also troubles we have created from industrial revolution. So intelligent people are those who understand what is happiness first, and then use the elements of the progress of science and other technologies to get to happiness. They don't get caught by the game of the scientific aspects, but they use the discoveries of science and technology to get to the ultimate goal, which is happiness. And this, according to Buddha, is happiness. Use technology to meet your material needs. Use science to take care of your health. But don't assume that science will also give you peace, science will give you community, science will give you friends, science will give you a good family. No. Wealth, even wealth will not give you all this. Wealth won't give you all this. So happiness must be understood as an objective concept, and we must learn to use our efforts, our progress, our wealth to get there, and not see wealth and success as an end in itself. That is the concluding message Harari gives in this chapter. In the next video, we will discuss, finally the concluding chapter, we will discuss what Harari has to say on the future of humanity. Where are we heading? He gives us a snapshot of where we might be going. Thank you.